Welcome back, everybody, to another special edition of the Decline and Fall Show. It is, as we previously discussed on our episode with Boris Malogurski, 30 years since the signing of the Dayton Accords, which brought the war in Bosnia and one phase of the wars that saw the destruction of Yugoslavia to a close. So to explore that further, because to understand the international relations picture in today's world, one has to understand the process by which Yugoslavia was destroyed and the wars which brought it to an end and how those wars were settled. So today, to explore this in more detail with regard to the Bosnian War and the Dayton Accords, we're joined by the scholar Harry Blain, all the way from the United States. Harry is the author of a recent paper entitled The Myth of Coercive Diplomacy, the U.S. Intelligence Community, and the War in Bosnia. So, Harry, welcome to the Decline and Fall Show.
Thanks for having me.
And Kit, as our resident man in the former Yugoslavia, would you like to kick off the discussion today?
Yeah, sure. So, first, again, I'd like to reiterate, thanks so much for joining us, Harry. It's a pleasure and honor. For viewers and listeners, I would urge you to try and track down a copy of Harry's paper, The Myth of Coercive Diplomacy. I'm sure if you email him nicely enough, he might do you the service of providing you with a copy. Yeah, I think that on top of the kind of looming anniversary of what was a hugely significant event in kind of modern history and in some ways, shaped the unipolar world that existed for the best part of 30 years subsequently, there are an enormous number of parallels between the war in Bosnia and the war in Ukraine. And this is a point that I and indeed Alex both independently and on Decline and Fall have made many times. We have both in Bosnia and Ukraine a client or a proxy who was encouraged to reject peace agreements, who was encouraged to reject negotiations, and then found themselves on the thin end of the wedge when the US decided that it actually wanted peace. And so there are very clear and quite palpable, relevances to the Bosnian War to what's happening now in Ukraine. So to kick us off, Harry, why don't you give us a bit of background on what led up to the war in Bosnia, which erupted in April 1992? The kind of the various peace overtures that were made in its lead up, and why they failed.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll just say, apropos what you mentioned at the outset about getting a copy of this article, probably a lot of your viewers and listeners are aware of the fact that academic publishing industry is a bit of a scam, and so to get a hold of this article for free, it's a bit of a challenge. So yeah, people should reach out to my email. It's on the Sacramento State University website. Just look me up, they'll find me, and I'll give them a copy. I've got preprints that I will very happily share to get around that. And there's also a shorter version of the piece in the Quincy Institute Responsible Statecraft blog from earlier in the year. So if you want the shorter version, that's it. As for the background about the war in Bosnia, yeah, I mean, obviously there's quite a few different pieces to it. Lots of books have been written about this and lots of articles as well. But obviously, the war is part of the wars surrounding the breakup of Yugoslavia. And, I use the term breakup. There's lots of different terms one could use, breakup, dissolution, destruction. Sometimes these more neutral terms like dissolution do make it sound like it was kind of a natural or inevitable process, which I would say it was not. I think that probably the origins of the whole breakup occurred in the 1980s, I would say, when inequalities between the different Yugoslav republics worsened and exacerbated to a great extent. My former dissertation advisor, Susan Woodward, wrote probably the definitive book about this called Balkan Tragedy. I think documents it all very well. And a lot of this was also basically a result of IMF loan and structural adjustment type of policies also. So there's a big story there, but I think that that's generally the essence of it, and the effect that this had within Yugoslavia, which was a highly decentralized state with 6 different republics, was essentially that the richer republics became more interested in basically secession. And I think it's important to note that the richer republics, which were particularly Croatia and Slovenia, they had a pretty ambivalent relationship with the Yugoslav state from the beginning. I think particularly Croatia. I mean, Croatia was part of the Yugoslav state that existed between the First World War and the Second World War, but actually seceded from that state with the assistance of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And the Croatian national movement was always quite strong and powerful. There was a significant Croatian national movement in the 1960s as well that was suppressed by the communist government in Yugoslavia and Belgrade. That was known as the Croat Spring. And so these forces, I think, became much more prominent in the 1980s. And I think they were a bit more economically driven in the sense that these richer republics didn't like the idea of subsidizing poorer republics or poorer regions within Yugoslavia. And another point that Woodward makes is that there became quite an increase in unemployment in Yugoslavia at this time as well. And this was unemployment that was affecting people who were in the Communist Party as well. So basically what happened is that Communist Party leaders within these different republics basically transformed into nationalists throughout the 1980s and started to promote secession. Now, obviously, the story that's most widely told in the mainstream accounts in the United States and in the West is about big bad Slobodan Milosevic and Serbian nationalism. That's a part of the story as well. There's no doubt about that. But I think in terms of understanding the breakup of Yugoslavia, it's important to note that the Serbian nationalism is far from the only nationalism that's present in driving these wedges between the different republics. And so the other piece of it was that the movements for Slovenian and Croatian independence were supported by Western countries, I think particularly by the newly unified German state. And the newly unified German state strongly supported Croatian independence efforts in 1990 and in 1991, and eventually Germany essentially unilaterally recognized the Croatian secession from Yugoslavia in December 1991. And I think that that was a particularly decisive moment in the breakup of Yugoslavia, because the secession of Slovenia was less of a concern because of the fact that Slovenia was still quite a small republic, and it also didn't really have as much of a multi-ethnic or multinational composition as some of the other republics did. But Croatia did. In particular, Croatia had a very large Serb minority, and this minority wanted to stay in Yugoslavia. So there was already a war that was going on in Croatia throughout 1991 prior to the formal recognition of Croatian independence. But then once Croatia got recognized, this put the Bosnian Muslim leadership in a slightly awkward position, because Bosnia was one of the 6 republics in the former Yugoslavia, and it was kind of a miniature Yugoslavia, at least to the extent that it had 3 principal national groups, neither of which could dominate the others on their own. The most numerous was the Muslim, or later to be known Bosniak group. The second largest was Bosnian Serbs, and then the smallest, but still about 15% of the population, maybe slightly less, was the Bosnian Croats. So the way that Bosnia had been governed in Yugoslavia was pretty much in a cooperative or consociational framework, consensus-based framework between these 2 different national groups, and they were referred to as national groups or as peoples, narod, in the Serbo-Croatian language. And this contract was obviously placed under great pressure by the secession of Croatia, because at that point, the Bosnian Muslim leaders contemplated very strongly independence from Yugoslavia as well. Exactly what kind of state they had in mind, I think, is up for debate. But certainly, Bosnian Serb leaders feared that this movement was basically to create something like a fundamentalist Islamic state in the former Yugoslavia, which is not something that they wanted to live under. Or I think more generally, they didn't like the idea of being reduced to the status of a national minority, having been an equal constituent nation in the state prior to that. So in this context, the Bosnian Muslim leaders pushed for independence. I do think, even though the documents I looked at weren't 100% clear on this, I think there's a decent amount of available documentary evidence otherwise, that the United States did actually play a pretty important role in encouraging Bosnian independence, and the ambassador, Warren Zimmerman, was quite decisive in doing that, and also in encouraging the Bosnian Muslims to reject the different efforts that were being made by European negotiators in early 1992 in Lisbon to try and come up with some agreement about the future of Bosnia that would have war. An agreement that basically would have looked like something resembling a partition of Bosnia between the different national groups, which I should emphasize would not have been very pretty, but maybe was the only option on the table at that particular time. So the United States basically was encouraging Bosnian Muslim leadership to secede. Once they seceded, the U.S. government immediately recognized them in April 1992. U.S. intelligence community was very clear. Secretary General of the United Nations was very clear. Lots of European leaders were very clear that this would lead to a civil war in Bosnia without a shadow of a doubt, because then the Bosnian Serbs would be fighting to remain within Yugoslavia and not be dragged out of this state against their will. At the beginning of the war, the Croats and the Bosnian Muslims teamed up with each other in the push for independence and against the Serbs, but later on throughout the war, they fought each other in some of the most brutal fighting of the war, in fact. And that was the origins of the war, more or less, and then it lasted until the end of 1995 with the signing of the Dayton Accords, and throughout that period, there were various efforts at bringing about peace agreements. I think throughout 1993, there were two major efforts that, again, you're correct in saying the U.S. government basically sabotaged by encouraging intransigence on the part of the Bosnian Muslim leadership, then being referred to as the Bosnian government because they had been formally recognized as the Bosnian government by the United States. So there was the Vance-Owen plan that was introduced at the beginning of 1993, which planned basically to divide Bosnia into different ethnic cantons, but still have the overarching framework of a unitary state. Certainly no right to secede for the Bosnian Serbs or the Bosnian Croats. So in fact, of all the plans, this was the one that was perhaps most resembling maintaining Bosnia or creating Bosnia in a sense as a unitary state. But the United States and U.S. diplomats were arguing against that from the beginning and criticizing that from the beginning. Some of that was actually a hangover from the 1992 presidential election, in which the Clinton campaign criticized the Bush administration for basically being too soft on the Bosnian Serbs and too weak on the question of Yugoslavia. So I think basically what ended up happening with the Vance-Owen plan is that the United States encouraged the Bosnian Muslims to take a pretty intransigent stand. And eventually the plan that was presented was one that was finally rejected by the Bosnian Serb Assembly because it basically promised to completely divide and completely chop up what would have been the Bosnian Serb regions into little Bajistans or cantons that they wouldn't have been able to really survive in viably as even an autonomous entity within Bosnia. And then later on in the year, at this point, Cyrus Vance, who was the envoy for the United Nations, had stepped down, but David Owen, who was the envoy for the European Union, European Community, he was still there, and then he was working with Thorvald Stoltenberg on another peace plan. That was the Owen-Stoltenberg plan. That one was much more favorable to the Bosnian Serb side. Bosnian Serbs accepted it. Bosnian Muslims were going to accept, but again, this was rejected by the United States, and they encouraged the Bosnian Muslims to reject it. It was another effort in 1994 to develop a peace plan. This was called the Contact Group Peace Plan. This one was much more widely supported by the United States and 4 other countries that were part of this contact group. I can talk more about that a bit later because there's some specific documentation on that. But this was one that was, I think, basically, at least at the beginning, more or less designed to fail. And it was given the most stubborn possible interpretation by the United States. They didn't really engage in any kind of good faith diplomatic dialogue with the Bosnian Serb side. And then the final proposal was the Dayton Agreement in 1995, which was much more favorable to the Bosnian Serbs than certainly the Vance-Owen plan was, certainly the original version of the contact group plan was. And I would say it did effectively, if not legally and literally, partition Bosnia by creating 2 separate entities within the Bosnian state, one of which would be a federation jointly governed by Croats and Muslims or Bosniaks, and then the other 49%, so more or less half of the country, was an autonomous Serbian republic with significant independence over just about every aspect of its internal affairs under the name Republika Srpska, which was broadly supported by the Bosnian Serb leadership. There were some complaints about the land deals in particular, that they would have to effectively evacuate and give up Sarajevo, as well as one enclave in particular within their territory, Gorazde. But they were more or less satisfied with the Dayton Agreement, and actually all of the documentary accounts from the time, the ones I've looked at, but actually prior ones as well, have actually recognized the fact that the group that was much the most concerned about Dayton during the negotiations, much the more worried about being ripped off and sold out, was far and away the Bosnian government side, because effectively they had been promised much more by the United States over the previous 3 years. So again, to that extent, I would echo what you said before, Kit, about the parallel with Ukraine. I think that's how the Ukraine war is probably going to end at some point, if it's not ended on the battlefield, which is, right now, the United States, and even towards the end of the Biden administration, I think it was clear the United States had climbed down from the initial positions that they had taken, and that they were ready to tell the Ukrainian government, you have to cut a deal right now. And that's obviously very, very different from what they were promising them 3 years ago. So that's a bit of a detailed summary, but I hope that gives a decent amount of background for the broad picture of the war.
Well, I mean, I think that's a superb foundation, Harry. Thank you very much. Alex, go ahead.
Well, just to retreat for a moment, Harry, back to the point about the disintegration of Yugoslavia as as a unified state in the 1980s. The part of this, you said, was rooted in economic problems, which were fueled by advice, in heavy inverted commas, from the International Monetary Fund. Now, from my memory, Yugoslavia in the Tito period took quite a number of loans from the IMF, which were initially on relatively favorable terms, but then payback very much started in earnest in terms of the demands made by the IMF regarding structural adjustment. That almost coincided with the death of Tito and at the beginning of the 1980s. So would you say that was a decisive factor in propelling the division between the Yugoslav republics, the terms that the IMF imposed on the Federal Republic?
Yeah, I would say that. And I would say that there was also, I think, probably some amount of domestic appetite for sort of neoliberal economic reforms in Yugoslavia in the 1990s within the different republics. In fact, one of the economic reformers was Slobodan Milosevic, was very much regarded as one of the liberal and neoliberal potential leaders and reformers by the West.
A banker, of course.
It's definitely someone whose background was indeed in finance. Yeah, I think that the imposition of austerity type conditions on Yugoslavia definitely had this kind of effect. But I would say it probably wouldn't have had the same effect in terms of the disintegration of the state if the state wasn't quite so decentralized. And the Constitution of 1974 in Yugoslavia decentralized the state immensely, to such an extent that the republics were almost functioning like sovereign states, and it's including over financial matters. So this also meant that implementation of any of the financial or structural adjustment programs would always have this strong regional imbalance, or this strong regional implementation. And so I do think that probably the combination of the economic crisis and also the massive decentralization of the Yugoslav state contributed to all of this. I think earlier on, after the Second World War, up until probably the end of the 1960s, Yugoslavia had actually achieved, I think, a very, very, very impressive level of prosperity and economic growth that I think is pretty well documented, actually, and was quite well known to contemporaries at the time in Europe. And it must be said, I think, that a major reason for that was, in fact, that the aid was extended to Yugoslavia by the United States immediately after Tito's break with Stalin in 1948, and it was extended on much more generous terms. And Yugoslavia did become, I think, a state that is still regarded probably by lots of people within the succeeding republics, nation states today, as kind of the example of how a communist state can actually function in a fairly effective way.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the case, and there is. I mean, in my experience, there's an enormous amount of nostalgia for those days, which are now long ago. But I mean, to move this back to your research specifically, What I found very interesting about your paper was the fact that you delve into how in 2013 there was a vast tranche of files related to the Bosnian War, including very sensitive, previously top secret CIA documents. Related to the war in Bosnia. And then it's not really until you've delved into them that they've been reported on accurately. So I mean, there's a dual question here, which is how does their actual content deviate from established accounts of what they contain and what happened in the conflict, and why do you think that reality has been obscured?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what the reality actually was, as I document in the article, most of what the Clinton administration was saying in public was being contradicted in private by the CIA and other intelligence agencies within the United States. And so that really went from the beginning of the war till quite near the end of the war, but particularly at the beginning of the war, because the Clinton campaign was talking in 1992, as I mentioned before, about how the Bush administration was basically being soft on the question of the Bosnian War. And so some of the things that they began to propose were basically different iterations of the use of force. They had talked about possibility of airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces that they did end up carrying out in 1994 on a very small scale, and on 1995 on a very large scale. The other thing that they contemplated and spoke about very publicly, and the Secretary of State Warren Christopher went to Europe in May 1993 to try and promote, was a policy of not just airstrikes, but also lifting what was a UN-imposed arms embargo on all parties to the conflict, at least lifting that embargo for the Bosnian government so that the Bosnian government could receive more weapons, level the playing field being the expression, which is also roughly translated to level the killing field, as we've seen in lots of other contexts. So that was another proposition. I would say the others mostly revolved around in some way beefing up the UN presence on the ground in Bosnia, because a UN protection force known as UNPROFOR was established in Bosnia at the beginning of the war, and always operating in very bizarre and difficult circumstances, because usually you would put a peacekeeping force in after you have a peace agreement, and here they put it in the middle of the war. And so formally UNPROFOR was supposed to be just ensuring the delivery of humanitarian aid to everybody, but I think it was clear from the beginning that actually the Bush administration, but then particularly the Clinton administration, and very much so the Bosnian government, wanted to use UNPROFOR essentially as an ally in the war. So this led, for example, to the policy in early 1993 of declaring certain enclaves of Bosnian government control safe havens that would be protected by UN forces. And the first one was Srebrenica, which was also the one that infamously fell in July 1995, but there ended up being 6 of these different safe areas across Bosnia. And all of these different policy measures, so the safe havens, the lifting of the arms embargo, airstrikes, also even airdrops of humanitarian aid, which is something the U.S. military did in early 1993. Every single one of these things, the CIA said it's a bad idea. Every single one. And they gave very good reasons why. The reason that was given some amount of attention from scholars and some amount of attention in public during the war was that the U.S. allies in Europe were very worried about a lot of these measures. The main reason they were worried about these measures was because particularly France and Britain had contributed thousands of troops to the UN protective mission on the ground. And so anything that would militarize that mission or would militarize that conflict would put their own troops in danger. So naturally, they were very concerned about sort of escalating measures in Bosnia in this early phase of the war. So that was kind of what was spoken about at the time. But in the intelligence documents, that is emphasized. But I think more broadly, there's great concern from the Balkan Task Force, which was established by the CIA early in the war, about the effect that all of this would have on the peace process. And I think that's maybe part that's not been quite so well documented, which is that basically even gesturing towards these kinds of military measures or militarized measures would encourage the Bosnian government to become more and more and more intransigent, would reject peace agreements or take the most maximalist positions in peace negotiations. Meanwhile, the intelligence community was saying very clearly from the beginning that the Bosnian Serb forces are open to a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Their idea is not to conquer all of Bosnia. They have no chance of doing that. Yes, they want to have as much territory as they can. They want it to be contiguous, and they want their gains to be consolidated. But every time they launch an offensive against the Bosnian Muslim forces, the CIA said the goal here is not extermination or conquest. The goal here is to push them to a peace agreement on the most favorable terms for the Bosnian Serbs. So they were open to diplomacy from the beginning. Obviously, the question always is on what terms, but that was not really what the administration was talking about in public. The administration was talking in public much more about this vicious force that was committing ethnic cleansing and committing atrocities against the duly constituted government of Bosnia. And so when one talks about the issue like that, and also emphasizes how big bad Slobodan Milosevic is behind everything, when in fact he was divided from the Bosnian Serbs basically from the beginning of the war, it becomes very difficult to climb down and generate any kind of peace process. So there was this big disconnect, in other words, between the intelligence community and the policymakers from the beginning. Intelligence community very skeptical about the use of force, administration favoring it quite significantly in public. And the other concern the intelligence community had that's worth mentioning is that there would be a spillover effect in Kosovo, because Kosovo had been an autonomous province of Serbia, very autonomous province, I should say, constitutionally, of Serbia under the 1974 constitution. And there were secessionist impulses in Kosovo as well. And the intelligence community warned that if there is military support for the Bosnian Muslims, that will then encourage the Kosovo Albanians to take similar measures in the hope of provoking Western intervention on their behalf, which ends up being a fairly prescient prediction, because that's exactly what ended up happening in 1998 and 1999.
Yeah, this was actually something I really wanted to dig into with you, because I think that's something that's really interesting that shines through in the files that you review, which is that it is repeatedly stated that by the CIA that one of the reasons that the US shouldn't undertake military action is that it would not on top of encouraging the Bosniaks to think that there was more military support coming, including up to and including your outright intervention, kind of a la Kuwait, that it would embolden Kosovo Albanian ultranationalists to stage an uprising against Serbia and proclaim independence. And this was, a disincentive at the time. And then we fast forward to less than 4 years later, and there was, of course, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia on the side of Kosovo Albanian ultranationalists. So it seems that this, what was a disincentive, turned into a compelling strategy. And in that time frame, you also have Madeleine Albright, who, as you document, was kind of open to a partition agreement with the Serbs that would allow for secession from Bosnia, to becoming this kind of tub-thumping anti-Serb war hawk. I mean, do you see that as related, perhaps?
Well, let me deal with the Albright issue first, and then the cost issue. And I should also, maybe I can also do it later, deal with the issue of why the documents haven't yet been used or treated or interpreted in the way that I'm doing here. But with respect to Albright is more the other way around. I mean, she was a hawk from the beginning. She presented herself as a hawk. She presented herself as someone who really knew the Serb mentality in a pretty racist fashion, apparently on the basis of living there for a couple of years when she was 8 years old, and also being born in what's now the Czech Republic. That was Albright's stance. I think a lot of it was her auditioning to become Secretary of State as well, because she was the ambassador to the UN in the first term of the Clinton administration. Certainly in public, she always took the most hawkish stances. And she actually did in private as well in the National Security Council meetings, even though from time to time she recognized exactly what the intelligence community was saying, that there would be disastrous humanitarian consequences for implementing airstrikes. She noted that in 1993, and yet she supported them nonetheless. It was later on in the war, it was in 1995 when Albright wrote her so-called endgame paper after the fall of Srebrenica in early August 1995, where she included her usual hawkish stuff, but she added right at the end that it would be potentially important or useful to generate a peace agreement to give the Bosnian Serbs the right to secede from Bosnia and join a greater Serbia. And she also supported population transfers that before she had said would be legitimizing ethnic cleansing. And so obviously that raises the question why she would do that, why she would change her position so drastically, even though the rights to secession didn't end up getting implemented for reasons I can explain. But she at least entertained it. And I think the fact that she at least entertained it is pretty noteworthy given how hawkish she was before. Well, it seemed to me that her basic point in that paper, and more generally, was that she had the sense that this disastrous war in Bosnia was going to screw the Clinton administration's foreign policy legacy and screw them in the election the next year in 1996. So they had to find a way to end it. So, in a way, like what Albright was saying, has some kind of similarities to probably what certain people within the Biden administration were saying towards the end about Ukraine, that it would be nice if we could end this before the election because it's electorally disastrous. But of course, they never ended up doing that. And things Albright was saying in private, and that other officials were saying in private in 1995 about the need to make big concessions to the Bosnian Serb side, the kind of stuff that Trump and his administration have, at least to their credit, talked about openly recently with respect to Ukraine. So yeah, Albright sort of, and like a lot of people, Albright presented this very hawkish image in public, but some of the rhetoric in private was actually quite different. Now, as for Kosovo, well, it was the intelligence community that was warning about effects on Kosovo during the Bosnian War. It wasn't policymakers. Policymakers did marginalize the Kosovo issue, the Kosovo question, from the Dayton negotiations, which is pretty noteworthy. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find anything in the documents that I looked at that explained why that was so, or gave a rationale for why that was so. But it seems pretty obvious that it would have screwed any possibility of coming up with an accord, particularly because during the Dayton Agreement, the villain of the story in America, Slobodan Milosevic, had actually become the key figure because he had been given the authority to negotiate on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs, and he was taking very, very moderate positions throughout Dayton. So they didn't want to antagonize Milosevic at Dayton. That's why they didn't include the Kosovo issue. So then why later on did they bomb the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia for 78 days in violation of international law on behalf of Kosovo Albanians? I would like to look at more of the internal documents to see that, but it's probably a combination of their desire to keep NATO relevant, but I think also a sense of unfinished business about Milosevic and still being upset about Milosevic and still fearing, I think, like it was during the Bosnia War, still fearing probably some domestic political implications if they didn't take military action against him and finally get rid of him, the villain who they had been casting in that role for the previous decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say that your paper, like, and your research, like, it fundamentally challenges this mythos that NATO's, I believe it was in August and September of 1995, that Operation Deliberate Force, which is this bombing of Bosnian Serb positions, and was reported by Time magazine at the time as bringing the Serbs to heel. That actually the real purpose was trying to get the Bosnian government to negotiate. That seems to be the overriding narrative. Seems to be that the intransigent Serbs need some bombing to see sense and come to the negotiating table. But that's not what you found.
No, I didn't find that in the intelligence community documents, but also they're not just assessments of what the CIA thinks is going to happen or what might happen. They're also documents that are providing accounts of the National Security Council meetings. So they're also commentary on what the policymakers are saying as well. There's not evidence in those documents, but particularly from the intelligence documents, of a need to bomb the Serbs into submission. In fact, they were saying the opposite. Right before the bombing started, days before the bombing started, the Balkan Task Force said that the problem at this point for bringing about a peace agreement is the Bosnian government. It's not the Bosnian Serbs. The Bosnian Serbs are willing to deal. They had also said at the end of 1994, actually based on stuff that was being said in public, that the president of the Bosnian Serb Republic, self-declared, not recognized at that point, Radovan Karadzic, was willing to trade territory around Sarajevo that the Serbs controlled for the enclaves of territory in eastern Bosnia, such as Srebrenica and Gorazde and Žepa, that were controlled by the Bosnian government. So, in other words, the intelligence community have been saying probably in 1994 even, you could have come up with some kind of proposal that would have given the Bosnian Serbs some of this territory in exchange for the territory around Sarajevo for the government. And that might have completely obviated the need for any of the horrible events that occurred throughout the war in 1995. I think that if there was a clear motive for the bombing in August, September for Operation Deliberate Force, it does seem from the evidence, it's slightly subtle, but Richard Holbrooke, I think, who was the chief negotiator at Dayton, was a bit more open about the fact in the documents that I looked at that the bombing is designed to actually act as a concession to the Bosnian government because they're having to swallow some fairly bitter pills. I think the main bitter pill that they're swallowing is that they're allowing the creation of essentially a state within the state, which is the Bosnian Serb Republic, with substantial autonomy. And they're basically being forced to sign up to de facto partition of their country. And so maybe if they get a bombing campaign, that will help them. And I think that the other piece of that was that the U.S. government, at least in public, was really insisting on the fact that the Bosnian government should end up with 51% of Bosnia and the Serbs should only end up with 49%. So I think there was also an effort there to try and rebalance the territory. And so during the bombing campaign, there was also an on-the-ground offensive by joint Croat and Muslim forces against the Serbs, which forced the Bosnian Serbs back and made the map more acceptable to the Americans and to the Bosnian government. And I just want to emphasize that the map was more acceptable to them, not necessarily that this was needed to bring the Serbs to the table. The Serbs were already at the table. They were already willing to negotiate. But I think that the problem at that point very clearly was the Bosnian government. And so the bombing served as a concession in a sort of symbolic sense. We're still on your side. But it also helped them to regain some territory, which then made the Dayton Accord somewhat more palatable to them. I say somewhat more palatable because, like I said before, they were still threatening to undermine the whole thing and walk out during Dayton. And the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, was brought in to threaten and cajole them during the Dayton negotiations to sign the agreement that they didn't want to sign. I think that the bombing really had that kind of function. It was also, I think, carried out in response to basically a sense of political humiliation in the United States as well. After the fall of Srebrenica in July 1995, then there was the bombing of Makala Marketplace again in August, which was attributed to the Bosnian Serb forces. But like the previous one of those bombings, I think that there was a suspicious speed and rapidity with which the U.S. government went to blame that on the Bosnian Serbs, and why they would do that in the middle of negotiations remains, I think, a bit puzzling. But in any event, there was just a need to do this to avoid a sense of political humiliation as well. But it certainly didn't have substantial strategic significance in terms of, as it was put on the front page of Time, bringing the Serbs to heel.
Yeah, just on the question of the internal dynamics of the Clinton administration, Harry, you mentioned of the clash between the elected and appointed political figures and the intelligence agencies' assessments of things on the ground. It's been commented upon by others who have studied this period in history that within the Clinton administration, there existed to a certain degree an element of, should we say, post-1989 messianism, a belief in, should we call it, some might call it liberal imperialism or humanitarian interventionism, really takes root in U.S. policy-making circles during this period. How much would you say that played a role in the developing of policy towards the Bosnian question and perhaps later the Kosovo question as well?
In my opinion, to quite a significant extent, but I would add another huge factor to the mix as well, which affects all of Clinton administration's foreign policy, which is domestic politics. And I'll come back to that in a second. But in terms of the question of messianism, yes, I think that is a factor. I saw that in some of the documentary record early on in 1993, when the National Security Council was frankly trying to work out what even to do. In Bosnia, there was an account of a meeting, I think it was from March, which is in the paper, in which they're discussing all of the different options. And then, as would sometimes happen in these meetings, President Clinton would come in a little bit later on. And right towards the end of the meeting, he's been given all of the options. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, is giving the numbers on the cost of enforcing the Varts-Owen plan, if that was ever going to happen. And people are sort of balking at that. And I think it was the Assistant National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, who said another option is that we can just wash our hands of this and say it's a European issue and leave it to the Europeans. And then Clinton said something that I think ended the conversation quite decisively and said, we can't do that without giving up our entire position in the world. So, okay, clearly a concern there, at least with U.S. dominance and U.S. hegemony. And that was definitely the essence of Albright's arguments in her Endgame paper that I mentioned before in August 1995. She mentioned something I think was quite interesting. She quoted Jacques Chirac, who had just been elected the president of France in 1995, who had said that there's no individual leader within the NATO alliance. And she said that comment has been chilling in my bones for weeks. That's what she put in the Endgame paper, her fear about U.S. global prestige being undermined, as if it was that prestigious to begin with. I think maybe the word we're looking for is power or hegemony or domination. She was very, very concerned about that as well. So, yes, it seems like that was definitely a factor in the foreign policy making in Bosnia. But a lot of it was driven by domestic politics as well. And I think the main way that it was driven by domestic politics was that, we have to remember that Clinton was not exactly elected with a very strong mandate in 1992. If it weren't for Ross Perot running as a third candidate, the most successful third-party candidate in American history, then Clinton wouldn't have won the presidency. So he was operating on a fairly thin majority. Not even in a majority in terms of votes, but he was operating on a very thin mandate, let's say. He always had his eye on domestic politics, and the administration always had their eye on domestic politics. And it was pretty clear also from the beginning that they were very concerned that any sort of climb down in their hawkish rhetoric throughout the 92 election would have disastrous domestic political consequences. It so happened as well that into 1993 and 1994, the Senator Bob Dole was emerging as the probable Republican nominee for president in the 1996 election. And Dole was leading the charge in the United States Congress for much more hawkish measures in the Bosnian conflict, particularly for unilaterally lifting the United Nations arms embargo, which actually in private, even the administration officials were pretty ambiguous about, because they were very concerned, I think, about its consequences on the ground, but mainly its effect on their relationship with European allies, and actually also their relationship with Russia at the time, with Boris Yeltsin. And I think there was an interesting paper from Anthony Lake in July 1994, and this is when this contact group peace plan was initially put forth, which set up this 51-49 division of Bosnia, but basically allowed the Bosnian government to keep control of all of its enclaves within Serb territory, and it didn't really specify what level of autonomy, constitutional arrangement the Serbs would have. So I think it was pretty clear from the beginning, and it also severed the Serb territory in two. It is clear from the beginning that the Serbs did not like that plan, but it seemed like they might be willing to negotiate about it. But Lake was saying, even though he was entertaining privately, maybe we could offer some kind of special association agreement between the Bosnian Serbs and Serbia in order to advance a peace process here. He was essentially saying we cannot negotiate in any way beyond that with the Bosnian Serbs. And he was basically planning, well, what do we do if they come back with the Russian diplomats and they come up with a viable solution? We have to basically hold the line, because we've already promised Congress that tough measures are going to follow if this peace plan is not accepted in whole and immediately by the Bosnian Serbs. So the domestic political forces were really significant in driving what Clinton did. I think separately they played a massive role in driving Clinton's decisions around NATO expansion as well, particularly after the disastrous 1994 midterm elections. And so I would really highlight that as being a critical factor as well, and probably from the documentary record that I looked at, perhaps an even more decisive factor than the concerns about U.S. global prestige. And I think naturally it sort of made sense that at the end of the day, probably a lot of the time, the primary concern of most people is just getting elected again. And they'd whipped up this domestic political atmosphere that was so against any kind of accommodation, any kind of peace process that would be somewhat favorable to the Bosnian Serb side, that backing away from that would have been a humiliation and disaster domestically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what's really interesting in all of the documents that you survey in your paper, but also you mentioned your piece for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, is like the U.S. policymakers, they seem to be all over the place, and seem to be guided by all manner of different, often kind of contradictory concerns. I mean, you mentioned, for instance, the need to square the kind of perceived need to square Russia, and in one of the documents that you've dug up, it's a lengthy kind of treatise on the necessity of ensuring that Russia is on board with everything that the US is doing in Bosnia to Bosnia, and then there's a section where it states, some Russians ask why the West and the US in particular should inject itself into an area Russia has always regarded as its traditional sphere of influence. The West should not take this argument very seriously in today's world. It hastens to add, which I think kind of accounts for a lot of the issues we see currently. But yeah, they seem to U.S. policymakers seem to be driven by all of these different, as I say, conflicting, contradictory forces in what they do and don't do. And this also, to my mind, it has some kind of relevance with the fall of Srebrenica, because this was perhaps the most shocking and most illuminating finding of yours, is that the fall of Srebrenica and Žepa subsequently, which we are told now was what shocked the US into action. It was initially viewed as a positive development in certain quarters of the US corridors of power.
Yeah, it was. And I think it was particularly presented thus in the endgame paper that was written by Anthony Legg for the National Security Council right after the fall of Srebrenica. And this paper has been credited by insiders within the administration. They really are insiders. They've also sort of rebranded themselves as scholars of the conflict. Derek Chollet and Ivo Dolda, particularly Ivo Dolda, who happened to work for Anthony Legg, so he's kind of the hero of Dolda's story. This document has been credited as basically changing the administration's position and bringing about this peace offensive, if you like, at the end of 1995. But yeah, I mean, the document says very clearly that given the fall of Srebrenica, Žepa hadn't fallen yet, and the likely fall of Žepa, we now have an opportunity to impose more realistic territorial solutions on the Bosnian government. This is the window of opportunity that has now opened, because Srebrenica was a huge barrier to a peace agreement. And so were the other enclaves of Bosnian government control within Serb territory, for obvious reasons. Bosnian Serbs are fighting for something like a state within a state. They want it to be more or less contiguous, so they don't want it to be a moth-eaten little republic that could easily be severed and destroyed. So places like Srebrenica were particularly important in that regard. I think they also had something of an emotional attachment to Srebrenica because of the fact that a great deal of atrocities had been committed against Serb villages from Srebrenica, which is something that was warned by the intelligence community as well, that turning Srebrenica or other enclaves into safe havens would actually just give an opportunity for government forces that were based there to break out and commit atrocities against Serbs nearby and then run back behind the UN lines and seek the protection of the UN, which had been going on ever since Srebrenica was declared to be a safe haven under the leadership of a pretty ruthless general, Nasser Oric, who ended up in The Hague after the war. And so, that obviously made Srebrenica, I think, particularly important from the Bosnian Serb point of view. And I think it was just an open secret, really, in Washington and probably in European capitals as well, that Srebrenica would not be part of the Bosnian government's territory in this final peace agreement. It would have to be part of the Bosnian Serb territory. The only question was how. How's it going to happen? It could have happened in the form of negotiation. Like I said, intelligence community reminded the policymakers in 1994, Karadzic was willing to trade the eastern enclaves for territory around Sarajevo, for example. That would have been the best way to do it. It still wouldn't have been pretty. The Muslims would have left, like the Serbs did end up leaving Sarajevo after the Dayton Agreement in 1995. But everyone knew it was basically a barrier to peace, a barrier to negotiation. And so when it fell, it actually kind of took away a bit of a problem on the map. And I think the administration was pretty clear about that internally, even if they presented a very different story externally.
Alex, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Just on the process that ultimately led to the Dayton Accords. You mentioned earlier on, Harry, how the haggling over the territory and the back and forth between the United States government and its previously chosen men in the form of Alija Izetbegović of the Bosnian Muslim or Bosniak government. Led to the process becoming this rather torturous thing that was ultimately seen by some on the Bosnian side as essentially selling them out in terms of what they were originally promised and what they ultimately got. So can you comment on like what you uncovered with regard to where the process of the Dayton Accords being negotiated, and how did Bosnia end up with the very complicated system of government that it has today, with the various different states within states overseen by this high representative, which has, it seems, sometimes almost unlimited powers. So could you go into that a little bit, please?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. All of that's quite important. I think at the end of 1995, during the Dayton negotiations, the American accounts, some of which were already out there, actually, to be fair to even Richard Holbrooke in his memoirs, he's not hiding the fact that he bullied the Bosnian government leaders during the Dayton negotiations. But there are other dispatches from Dayton in the documents that were declassified in 2013 that document and show a lot of concern, in particular about divisions within the Bosnian leadership. So you had Izetbegović, you also had Haris Silajic, who was the prime minister. And then you had another very interesting character who's decisive to the whole war, really. It was just Mohammed Šačerbegović is how he was born in Yugoslavia, but his parents left and moved to the United States. And they changed their last name to Šačerbe, and he became known as Mo Šačerbe. He spoke fluent English. He played as a linebacker in high school American football, which doesn't mean that much to me, but maybe it means a lot to people in the United States. And he was the UN ambassador for Bosnia throughout the war. And then towards the end, he also became the foreign minister. They wrote lots of nasty things about him in these dispatches, that he was trying to sabotage the agreement, that he was only interested in seeking the limelight. So maybe they should try to work with Silajic instead, because Silajic is a little bit more moderate, but he's also a bit unpredictable. Holbrooke wrote something like, it's extremely difficult to engage the Bosnian government leaders in any kind of serious negotiation. And the other piece that they mentioned as well, with respect to the intransigence of the Bosnian government leaders, was that they had received a lot of support throughout the war, and the United States was aware of this and really to some degree participated in this. It's also very much documented in the material that I looked at. They were getting military support. They were just getting it through violating the arms embargo, and that was primarily from the Islamic Republic of Iran. By the end of the war, and they also received a fairly large influx of Mujahideen fighters from the Middle East and Afghanistan as well. And so the U.S. diplomats were concerned that this support from outside, which the U.S. government had turned a blind eye to and or enabled throughout the war, was also emboldening the Bosnian government leaders to be more intransigent throughout Dayton. And so, yeah, it did get to the point, it seemed. I think still we need more documents to be declassified about all of this, but it certainly got to the point where the U.S. government, the U.S. representatives were threatening the Bosnian government to sign or be in big trouble. And effectively what they were saying is, if you don't sign at this point, we're going to take UNPROFOR out, so you're going to have no UN protection. We're going to actually enforce the arms embargo against you. We're going to cut off flows of weapons to you. And they had also promised to try and sweeten the deal of Dayton to provide an equip and train plan for a Bosnian Muslim militia, essentially. I mean, basically like an army, but each group was able to have their own forces under the Dayton Agreement. And so they said, you're not going to get that either. So, yeah, the U.S. government, I think, did do rather a lot at Dayton to force the Bosnian Muslim side to accept it. Exactly what the Bosnian Muslim side wanted is, I think, difficult to say precisely for the reasons I said, that there were divisions among them as well. So what came out of Dayton in the end was, like I said, a de facto partition of Bosnia into the Serbian Republic and the Bosnian Croat Federation, with massive autonomy for both, and a complex system within the Bosnian Croat Federation as well. So a further cantonization within the Bosnian Croat Federation, further decentralization within the Bosnian Croat Federation, to such an extent that I would probably argue that since Dayton or under Dayton, under the Dayton Constitution, the people who are most satisfied with it generally are the Bosnian Serbs. Bosnian Serbs are pretty satisfied with Dayton. I think that's clear in opinion polls. I think that's clear in the behavior of Bosnian Serb political leaders as well. They like the Dayton Agreement. They've got basically what they need. They have a special parallel relationship with Serbia. You can go from Serbia to Republika Srpska without a passport. You just need to bring your lična karta, your national ID. You're all good. It is true that the leaders of Republika Srpska, actually Milorad Dodik, the current president, who's presented in the West as some kind of anti-Dayton, anti-Western guy, when in fact he signed off to all kinds of centralizing measures within Bosnia, such as getting rid of the use of the Serbian dinar currency within Republika Srpska, and using the mark, the Bosnian mark, which is the currency of Bosnia, providing the license plates, although they only have on the license plates in Republika Srpska letters that are also exactly the same in the Cyrillic alphabet. So there was something of a compromise made there. But the Dayton Agreement itself was, I think, pretty positive for the Bosnian Serbs, and because of the fact that they could effectively govern themselves, and they didn't have the issue that existed in the Federation, which was the Croats and the Muslims having to share power in this complex cantonized structure. Because of this fact, or at least partly because of this fact, I think ever since the Dayton Agreement was signed, even though it was celebrated in Washington for obvious reasons, both Bosnian Muslim leaders and the U.S. government and some leaders in Europe have constantly been pushing to undermine the Dayton Agreement, or at least to undermine the autonomy given to the Bosnian Serb Republic. And the two main mechanisms for doing that, I would say, have been, number one, like you mentioned, the Office of the High Representative, Alex, which is an office that was set up to implement the civilian aspects of the Dayton Peace Agreement. And that's all it says in the Dayton Constitution. It doesn't say that this person's going to have the power to issue binding decrees on the entire state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. But that's actually what the High Representative has gone on to do. That the High Representative has been weaponized to engage in all kinds of centralizing measures within Bosnia, including centralizing measures that are absolutely humiliating to the Bosnian Serb political leaders. Like, for example, that they cannot deny that what occurred in Srebrenica was a genocide, but it's illegal for them to do that. That's a decree from an unelected, usually European diplomat. So that was something that was imposed on them. High Representatives also rewritten the election law throughout all of Bosnia as well. The Constitutional Court, I think, has also been seen as a mechanism for centralization by the external powers as well. And so I think probably in this context, what you see happening in Bosnia today, and what you've seen happening in recent years with Bosnian Serb secessionists, and big bad Milorad Dodik is taking on this role as the chief secessionist in a lot of the Western media. This is all just reaction to efforts by the external players and the Bosnian government to undermine the Dayton Agreement. The Dayton Agreement is very satisfactory to the Bosnian Serb side. They've never had any desire to overturn it or overthrow it. All they've wanted is to make sure that the autonomy that's guaranteed to them within it is upheld. And whenever that's challenged, that's when they start to threaten to secede, because they say, if you want to undermine the Dayton Agreement, if you want to impose high representatives on us who haven't even been approved by the Security Council, which was how they were approved before, if we're going to be ruled by decree from Sarajevo, which is not what we understood the Dayton Agreement is about, I think a fair reading of the Dayton Constitution says that's not how it's going to operate, then screw you. We will simply secede and go Serbia. So that those kinds of threats of secession from the Bosnian Serb leadership are all basically in response to these efforts at centralization, which in turn are basically efforts by the U.S. U.S. is less involved now, I would say, but U.S., Europeans, and Bosnian Muslim government leaders to essentially rewrite the Dayton Agreement.
Yeah, I mean, so do you see the, I mean, given these disjunctures and fissures, I mean, do you see Dayton as being maintainable, like in the present context? What do you think is the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina at this stage?
Yeah, tough question, obviously. And it's always awkward from outside to try and predict the sustainability of a state. You know, I have a good friend, a very good friend in Banja Luka, the capital of Republika Srpska, who tells me whenever we talk about the politics of the issue, look, Harry, just tell me if you think I need to pack my bags and leave. That's all he wants to know. Doesn't want to know anything more than that. And it's a difficult task for us from the outside to try and predict what's going to go on within Bosnia. I think one of the best scholars of the whole breakup of Yugoslavia and Bosnia today, who speaks fluent Serbo-Croatian and lives in Belgrade, is Robert Hayden, who is an anthropologist at the University of Pittsburgh. He did a recent study that I've looked at. I haven't looked at it in enough depth yet, but it's interesting. It's about the kind of impact on the ground of Dayton, and I think the long and short of it is that it's I suppose it's sad, but it's what happens in a war like this, is that the partition of Bosnia has really happened on the ground. There's not, like there used to be prior to the war, there's not very much ethnic mixing in Bosnia anymore, and that's kind of sad given the history of multi-ethnic living in Bosnia. But it also tells you that Dayton is kind of stable, and I think that in that sense Dayton is kind of stable. And it sort of brings up the fact, or it brings up the argument, that Dayton is not just being held together by the implicit or more or less explicit threat that NATO will use military force to keep it together if necessary. So, like, for example, when Dodik has recently been on trial, essentially, for defying the edicts of the High Representative in Sarajevo, and in response to this, he's been threatening secession, having meetings with the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, designed to send that signal. Then there's NATO air exercises going on in Bosnia. As a result of that, it's kind of a clear message that we're going to uphold Dayton with force. And there was an implementation force in the beginning. But I think Hayden's argument suggests it's not just about the threat of force that's keeping Dayton together. It also has effectively ratified the partition that took place in these bloody 3 years of war. And so in that sense, I think it's perhaps rather more stable than maybe some would suggest. But I think that the problem is, rather like I said before, that if the Bosnian Serb leaders and you know, maybe a lot of Bosnian Serbs more generally are under the impression, which is based on reality, that the government in Sarajevo, the Office of the High Representative, and external powers are going to essentially try and destroy the power or the autonomy of Republika Srpska, then they'll definitely secede. I see no other alternative than for them to secede. At some point, they might make that effort. And perhaps at some point that is how all of this is going to end, that Dayton is effectively a prelude to partition in legal terms, and that the Bosnian Serbs do end up joining Serbia in some way, shape, or form. I think that that's a possibility in the future. And, that would obviously raise lots of questions in the West about how to respond. But, I'd come back to the fact that Madeleine Albright, Anthony Lake, Thorvald Stoltenberg, Vance Owen, they had all said at some point or another during the war that we might have to be willing to give the Serbs the right to secede, actually, even though they didn't end up putting that in the Dayton Agreement. So I think that that's a possibility if the Serb leadership population feel sufficiently provoked to do it. And then, obviously there'll be big questions about what would be the consequences of that. The other thing worth keeping in mind with respect to the stability of Bosnia always is what's the relationship between the Muslims and the Croats within the Federation. And I think there are tensions there as well. And in some ways, in terms of like day-to-day politics, I think that might be the most dysfunctional aspect of the Bosnian state, the aspect of the Bosnian state that's most unstable. So I think that could potentially be a source of instability as well. But I think overall, I would say my assessment of Dayton is actually a pretty positive one in terms of essentially recognizing reality and essentially admitting defeat. That's how I see the Dayton Agreement and recognizing that the Bosnian Serbs couldn't be defeated militarily. I don't think they could have been defeated militarily even with an external intervention. The intelligence, a full external intervention, boots on the ground. Even the U.S. intelligence community was warning about that as well. And so I think that the Dayton simply recognized the reality of what happened throughout the war. And to that extent, I think it's been successful. Even if it doesn't, ultimately survive in the form that it currently has, which I suppose at some point it probably won't, I still think it could be labeled a success because it recognized the reality. And obviously it has given Bosnia 30 years without war. So it does mean that a lot of younger people today have not grown up with the experience of war in Bosnia, which is a pretty significant and important thing.
Okay, well, Alex, unless there's anything else you want to add, I think that was a tour de force, Harry. And we are, again, humbled and delighted for your presence. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, guys. I appreciate it. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, well, where can how can people find you? Are you on Twitter? Are you on Substack? Is there some way that people can support your excellent work?
I guess for now, just follow me on Twitter. It's @HBlain. I do want to get a Substack guy. I don't have one yet, but for now,
Commend it. It's a good platform. It's a good platform.
Yeah. I'm gonna do that at some point.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Harry, for joining us. And just a reminder to the audience that the paper is called The Myth of Coercive Diplomacy, the U.S. Intelligence Community and the War in Bosnia. Harry, Blain, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, guys.